The stars were burning. One by one, the worlds of the Varnan League were falling into silence. Great cities that had once shined across the night now floated as broken ashes in space. Their fleets, vast and proud, were gone, eaten alive by something that moved like a storm and devoured everything it touched. The Krail. They came without warning. A hive-mind species that consumed not just bodies but the very life of planets. Every world they conquered became a grave. Every voice they silenced made the next scream louder. The Varnans tried to resist. They gathered their armies, built massive fleets, and called on every ally they had ever known. But one by one, the allies stopped answering. When the League's High Council gathered for the last time, the room was quiet. The lights flickered from damage to the power grid, and the once proud faces of the alien leaders were pale with fear. Their voices trembled. "The Krail have breached the core systems," said Elder Soren, his mandibles shaking. "Our fleets are gone. Our people are dying in the billions. There is no one left." Silence fell again. The weight of extinction filled the air. Then one voice, a young scientist named Alira, spoke. "There is one world we have not called." Heads turned. The council members frowned. "You can't mean Earth?" asked another, his tone sharp. "That world of death? Of savages?" "Yes," Alira said. "The humans." Murmurs spread through the chamber. The Varnans had long feared humans. They called them Death Worlders, a species that had evolved on a planet filled with poisons, storms, and predators. To most galactic civilizations, humans were an anomaly, a brutal, unpredictable people who had clawed their way into the stars with sheer stubbornness and rage. They were not allies. They were survivors. "They fight for profit," said one council member bitterly. "They fight for sport." "They fight," Alira said softly, "and they win." Her words hung in the silence like a challenge. Finally, Elder Soren rose. His eyes were tired. "If we do nothing, we die. If we call the humans—" He paused, looking around the room. "Then perhaps we live long enough to regret it." The council agreed. The last transmission of the Varnan League was sent through the void, carried on fading signal beams that reached across the endless dark. It was a message made not of hope but of desperation. "To the humans of Sol, if any still hear us, please, we beg for heroes." The message reached Earth weeks later. In the old war bunkers beneath Geneva, the Earth Defense Council gathered. The faces there were not kind or hopeful. They were the faces of people who had seen too many wars. Humanity had changed since it entered the stars. Peace had never lasted long. Every time they reached for it, someone or something tried to take it away. The hologram of the Varnan Council played in the air. Their voices cracked with fear. Their eyes pleaded for mercy. And when the message ended, the room was silent. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Admiral Elias Kane, an old soldier with scars running down his neck, finally broke the silence. He leaned forward, his voice quiet and steady. "They want heroes," he said. "Do we have any left?" The generals and commanders looked at each other. Some looked away. There were no capes, no shining armor, no noble speeches anymore. Humanity had learned that heroism didn't win wars. Monsters did. Kane stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Heroes? No." He looked around the room with hard, tired eyes. "But we still have soldiers." The decision was made. Across Earth, hidden bunkers came alive. Engines roared to life in hangars buried under mountains. Old flags were raised again, black, scarred, and marked with a single phrase, "For humanity." The 13th Expeditionary Legion was reactivated. These were not the heroes Earth showed the cameras. These were the ones who had been buried after wars no one wanted to remember. Soldiers who had fought on worlds so deadly that even their names were erased from maps. They were survivors, killers, ghosts of every ugly war humanity had ever fought. And when they heard the Varnan distress call, they didn't hesitate. They didn't ask for thanks. They didn't ask for mercy. They simply prepared their weapons and stepped into the waiting dark. As their ships rose from the earth and broke through the clouds, the world watched in silence. Mothers held their children close. Veterans stood at attention. And somewhere deep inside, humanity whispered a single bitter truth. When others begged for heroes, Earth sent what it always had: its monsters. The Varnan fleet waited in silence above their shattered moon. They had expected to see shining ships, bright symbols of hope and courage coming from Earth. They imagined heroes wrapped in gold armor, their banners carried by light, bringing justice and salvation. What arrived instead was something else entirely. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace like a storm breaking the sky. Their ships were dark, scarred, and heavy with armor. Every surface bore the marks of old battles, claw marks, burn streaks, and names of lost worlds scratched into their hulls. The largest ship, Erebus, led the formation, its massive engines glowing blood red as if it carried a heartbeat of fire. The Varnan commander, General Vera, stood on the observation deck of his flagship and stared. These are not peace vessels, he whispered. Beside him, his aide trembled. They look like war machines. They are, Vera murmured. And the ones inside. I fear what they might be. The first human ship landed on the surface of Tassal, the League's last fortress world. The ramp fell open with a hiss of smoke and armored figures marched out, tall, silent, and covered head to toe in matte black armor. No insignia, no ranks, no smiles. Just helmets with cold, glowing visors. The Varnan soldiers gathered around, whispering. Some stepped back in fear. Others simply stared, unsure whether to salute or run. Then their leader appeared, Colonel Mara Holt. Her face was half scar, half steel. One of her eyes was artificial, glowing faintly blue. Her voice was steady but carried a quiet weight, the voice of someone who had buried more friends than she could remember. She looked at the frightened alien commander who had come to greet her. Colonel Mara Holt, 13th Expeditionary Legion. We're here to help. General Vera hesitated, his wings twitching nervously. Help? You mean? You are the heroes from Earth? Mara gave a slow, humorless smile. Heroes died a long time ago, General. We're what came after. The humans wasted no time. They began fortifying the ruined cities, setting up weapon grids and forward bases with a precision that left the Varnans speechless. They worked in silence, without complaint, without rest. Even when acid rain poured from the toxic clouds, they didn't stop. One night, a young Varnan engineer tried to speak to one of the humans. You people, why do you fight like this? You don't even seem afraid. The soldier didn't look up from his weapon. Fear keeps you alive, he said, but it doesn't win wars. He paused, tightening the strap of his armor. We're not here to live. We're here to finish this, the engineer didn't understand. Not yet. Rumors spread quickly among the Varnan ranks. They said the humans could see in the dark. They said they didn't sleep. That they injected something into their veins that kept them awake for days. They said they had fought beasts far worse than the Krail and had come out. Laughing, the Varnans called them Deathborn. When the human medics treated wounded Varnans, they didn't flinch at the smell of blood or the sight of missing limbs. They just worked, fast, brutal, efficient. And when they lost a patient, they didn't cry or pray. They simply zipped the body bag, wiped their hands, and moved on. To the Varnans, it looked heartless. To the humans, it was mercy. Colonel Holt stood on the walls one night, staring at the dark horizon where the Krail were gathering. A soft wind blew the ashes of fallen cities into the air. General Vera approached quietly. I've seen your people work. You do not eat. You do not rest. You do not speak much. He looked at her tired face. How long have you been fighting? Holt didn't answer for a while. She finally said, long enough to forget what peace looks like. The general bowed his head. I asked for heroes. Holt turned her gaze toward the stars, her eyes reflecting faint blue light. You got soldiers, she said softly. That's what's left when heroes die. By dawn, the first wave of the Krail began to move. Their shrieks echoed through the ruins as millions of dark forms crept toward the human lines. The Varnans trembled in their trenches. Some whispered prayers, some prepared to flee. The humans stood still. No trembling. No fear. Colonel Holt raised her rifle.
Hold the line, she said quietly. And for the first time in their history,
the Varnans saw what true monsters looked like. Calm, silent, and ready to burn a world to save it. The humans had come, and the universe would never be the same again. The sky over Tassal burned red. The Krail had arrived. Millions of them poured across the ruined plains, claws glinting like sharpened steel, carapaces clicking and chittering in a sound that made even hardened Varnan soldiers shiver. Their numbers were endless. Ships rained down from orbit, dropping more of the monstrous invaders, and the ground itself seemed to quake under the weight of their advance. The Varnans panicked. Their formations broke instantly, scattering in every direction. Some tried to fight, but the Krail moved too fast. Their weapons cut through alien defenses as if they were nothing. Fear spread like wildfire, then the humans landed. By the end of the day, the legend of the humans had grown. Even the first wave of the 13th Expeditionary Legion, touched down amidst the chaos. Their dropships exploded through the clouds with deafening engines, and from them poured soldiers clad in black armor, weapons glowing with deadly energy. They did not march in orderly lines. They surged forward like predators, calculating, precise, and terrifying. One human soldier swung a massive chain blade, cutting a Krail in half mid-leap. Another fired twin plasma pistols, not aiming at the head or body, but the joints and claws, disabling enemies faster than the eye could follow. The Varnans watched in horror as the humans moved, not like soldiers but like something older, something that had been born to survive impossible odds. A young Varnan medic named Lyra ran alongside a human squad trying to keep up. She had never seen anyone fight like this. She watched a soldier grab a dying Krail by its mandibles, slam it into the ground, and then turn, firing 2 shots into another wave that had rushed from the side. Blood, chitin, and fire filled the air. Why do they fight like this? She asked, her voice shaking. One human glanced at her without stopping. His visor glowed red in the darkness. Because if we don't, you die. Colonel Mara Holt was everywhere at once. She moved from squad to squad, leading charges through collapsing buildings, through fire and smoke. Her orders were simple: kill, survive, protect. She did not pause to admire the bravery of her soldiers. They were trained and they were monsters. That was enough. The first Krail waves met resistance, but every Varnan soldier knew they could not hold alone. The humans did not hesitate. They held the Varnan lines while simultaneously attacking the Krail's advance, turning every ruined building into a trap, every street into a killing zone. Mines, flamethrowers, explosive traps. They had thought of everything, and yet even with all that, the Krail kept coming. The battle became a blur of screams, fire, and clawed corpses. Humans fell, but they did not die quietly. One soldier, caught in the jaws of a Krail, pulled his arm free, grabbed a grenade, and blew the creature apart, the shrapnel taking off half of his own limb. He limped away, firing at the next wave. No one flinched at the sight of the wounded. To the humans, survival came before pain. From the high vantage of the Varnan observation tower, General Vera watched in disbelief. They are monsters, she whispered to herself. She had asked for heroes, for saviors, and yet what she saw was something darker, more terrifying. These humans were not angels. They were predators, her assistant gasped. They're killing, without mercy. They're saving us, Vera said, voice trembling. They're doing what we cannot. By nightfall, the Krail had been repelled, at least for the moment. Fires burned across the city, smoke blotting out the stars. The ground was littered with bodies, alien and human alike. The humans stood among the ruin, exhausted but unbroken. Their armor was scorched, weapons smoking, yet their eyes, glowing through visors, burned with something no one could name: determination. Lyra approached Colonel Holt, her hands shaking. How do you do it? How do you keep going when they never stop? Holt looked at her, and for a brief moment the soldier's mask lifted to reveal a scarred, pale face. We don't stop, she said simply. Because if we do, everyone else dies. That's what makes us monsters. That's what makes us human. And in that moment, the Varnans understood. The humans were no heroes. They were not shining knights sent to save the day. They were the survivors of a cruel universe, forged in fire, honed by death, and willing to become monsters to protect those who could not protect themselves. The Krail would return. That much was certain. But now the Varnans knew that Earth had sent something far more dangerous than heroes. It had sent its monsters, and monsters. Monsters always survive. The night after the first battle was quiet, but it was not peace. The city of Tisal smoldered, its streets littered with ash and broken bodies. Fires burned in the distance, and the smoke twisted like ghosts through the shattered skyline. The Varnans moved cautiously, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. They had called for heroes, but what they had received was something far stranger, something terrifying. Whispers began immediately. Among the soldiers, in hushed tones, they spoke of the humans. They called them monsters in armor, not because they were cruel, but because they were unstoppable. They did not fear death. They did not flinch at pain. They did not hesitate to strike, even when all hope seemed lost. A young Varnan lieutenant named Sela huddled beside her squad in a ruined building. "Did you see them?" she whispered. "They tore through the Krail like they were nothing. She swallowed hard. They smiled while doing it." Her squad mate shook his head, pale. "No, it wasn't a smile. It was hunger. They are hungry for the fight, and we are barely alive." Sela shivered. She had always imagined heroes as shining figures, brave and kind. But the humans were not heroes. They were something older, harder. Something born from endless struggle, fire, and survival. The whispers spread beyond the battlefield. The Varnan High Command began receiving reports of human soldiers performing acts that seemed impossible. One soldier had stormed an entire Krail nest alone, emerging with dozens of prisoners rescued, many of them injured beyond hope, and yet he had not even broken a sweat. Another had walked through a hail of claws and plasma, dragging a wounded Varnan officer to safety, while cutting down enemies faster than any squad could keep up. They moved like shadows, silent but deadly. They coordinated without speaking. Even when their comrades fell, they didn't pause to mourn. They just continued the fight. The Varnans started calling them Deathborn. It was not just their fighting that scared the Varnans. It was the way the humans seemed to ignore pain, fear, and exhaustion. One Varnan medic, Aelin, watched a human soldier rip open his armor to stop a bleeding teammate. The soldier's own injuries were severe, his body torn, yet he kept working, kept moving, kept killing. "Why?" Aelin asked, voice trembling. A human beside him, wiping blood from his gloves, didn't look up. "Because if we stop, you die," he said flatly. Aelin's jaw went slack. He had never understood what it meant to fight without hope and still win. Humans made it look effortless, terrifyingly effortless. By the next day, the human presence had reshaped the morale of the Varnan forces. Where before there had been despair, now there was awe. Where before there had been fear of the Krail, there was fear of the humans. Soldiers whispered in corners, avoiding direct eye contact, as if looking at them too closely might awaken some hidden ferocity. At night, the humans did not celebrate. They did not laugh. They did not sing. They repaired weapons, mapped enemy movements, and trained endlessly. Some Varnans tried to talk to them, to understand their mindset. The answers were always the same, simple, brutal, and frightening. "We do what is necessary," they said. "We survive. You survive. That is all that matters." Colonel Holt observed this quietly from the city walls. Her eyes scanned the horizon where fires still burned and Krail shrieks echoed from the distance. A Varnan child, part of a refugee group, approached her with wide, fearful eyes. Are you a hero?" the child asked softly, clutching a small mechanical toy. Holt crouched, looking at the small alien. She let her armor clank softly as she shook her head. "No," she said gently. "Heroes die early. What you see is something worse. Survivors. Monsters. But we're all you've got right now." The child stared, unsure whether to be terrified or grateful. Arnan generals whispered about them in private meetings. "They are not like us," one said. "They are not like anyone in the galaxy. We called for heroes, but the universe sent us something else." Holt, watching from the walls, knew they were right. She had seen what humanity could do, and she knew the truth they would never admit aloud. Humans were not made to be heroes. They were made to survive. They were made to be monsters when the world demanded it. And in the quiet of the ruined city, under the red-streaked sky, the Varnans realized something they had never expected. They were no longer just afraid of the Krail. They were afraid of the humans because monsters do not stop, and monsters do not forgive. The Krail Hive fleet was enormous. Millions of ships, black as night, stretched across the stars like a swarm of locusts ready to devour everything. Each vessel bristled with weapons, each teeming with soldiers that had already destroyed countless worlds. The Varnan High Command, hidden in orbit above their last safe city, stared at the incoming threat in disbelief. Their armies were shattered. Their fleets were in ruins. And yet from Earth a single force had arrived. Humans. Admiral Kane stood on the bridge of the flagship Erebus, his hands gripping the rail so tightly his knuckles whitened. The crew around him worked in silence, monitoring the Krail ships as they advanced. Even the veterans felt the weight of hopelessness pressing down. "Sir," one officer said, voice trembling. "Their numbers, it's impossible. We can't win." Kane didn't look up. His voice was calm, but it carried the kind of certainty only those who had faced death too many times could have. We don't have to win, we just have to survive long enough to fight them back. And that was exactly what the humans intended to do. Colonel Mara Holt's 13th Legion deployed across the Varnan surface and orbit. Dropships fell like black hail, landing squads of soldiers who had been trained for death since birth. Every ship, every soldier, every weapon had been optimized for a single goal: survival and destruction. The humans didn't hesitate. They didn't wait for orders. They spread out, creating kill zones, mining choke points and setting traps that could crush entire Krail battalions in a single moment. Explosives, flamethrowers, plasma turrets. They had thought of everything, and they had planned for the worst. The first wave hit. The Krail descended like a flood of darkness, claws and teeth tearing through the ruined cityscapes. But the humans stood firm. They fought with precision, speed, and savagery. One human soldier carrying nothing but a heavy rifle and a grenade belt cleared an entire street of hundreds of Krail before moving to the next, dragging a wounded Varnan along without slowing his pace. From orbit, Varnan pilots reported the same horrifying sight. Human dropships would descend into the thick of the Krail swarm, unload soldiers, and then detonate self-destruct charges to annihilate entire groups of the enemy. The survivors of these strikes would emerge from secondary dropships, moving like predators through the carnage. The Varnans could not understand it. Some whispered, "They are worse than the Krail themselves." Holt heard the whispers. She didn't respond. Monsters never explained themselves. The humans began to push the Krail back. Entire regiments fell under their relentless assault, yet the swarm never truly stopped coming. The Krail adapted quickly and the humans adapted faster. They moved through the ruins, dragging explosives behind them, firing into enemy tunnels, cutting off supply lines. Even when a squad was surrounded, they would fight to the last breath, throwing grenades, knives, and bodies to hold the line. At one point, Holt herself led a strike against a Krail command nest. Her squad moved silently, cutting down sentries with brutal efficiency. When the hive emitted a shriek that rattled the ground, Holt raised her arm and activated a device that detonated the nest, collapsing the tunnels on top of the Krail leader. Her squad emerged, covered in soot and blood but unbroken. A Varnan officer nearby whispered to his aide, voice trembling, "No one should survive that. No one." Holt's words came back to him, though she had not spoken them aloud. "We survived because heroes die too early." By nightfall, the humans had turned the tide. The Krail fleet, which had seemed endless, was now fractured. Hundreds of ships had been destroyed. Swarms of soldiers had been decimated. Yet even as they celebrated this small victory, the humans did not smile. They did not rest. They surveyed the horizon, planning the next move, preparing for the next wave. Admiral Kane addressed the surviving Varnan commanders in orbit. "You wanted heroes," he said, his voice carrying through the comms. "Look around you. What you see are not angels. They are monsters. They are everything we had to become to survive, and they are ours." The Varnans fell silent. They were afraid. They were awed. They were beginning to understand the truth. Colonel Holt stood on the ruins of a burned-out plaza, watching the red haze of distant fires. Her soldiers moved like shadows through the smoke, methodical and unstoppable. She knew the Krail would not stop. She knew more would come, and yet she did not falter. Somewhere deep inside, she allowed herself a brief thought. This is why we survive, because monsters do not yield. Monsters do not forgive, and monsters change the course of worlds. The Varnans whispered among themselves, finally admitting it aloud. "We called for heroes," one said, "and the universe sent us something else entirely." And above the battlefield, as the fires of Tassal burned brighter than the stars, the humans prepared for the next fight, their monsters' eyes gleaming, ready to defend not just Earth, but everything the galaxy had left. The Varnan capital burned under the red sky. Smoke coiled from the shattered towers, and the ground shook with the weight of the Krail army. Millions of clawed soldiers swarmed through the streets, tearing apart the last defensive lines. Panic rippled through the Varnan survivors. Their fleets were destroyed, their armies decimated, and above all, the hive mind that had already eaten countless worlds loomed closer than ever. Colonel Mara Holt stood at the front of the human line, her black armor scorched and streaked with blood. Her eyes, glowing faintly through her visor, scanned the horizon where the Krail advanced without hesitation. The humans of the 13th Legion were fewer than 1,000 now, and yet they moved as one, silent and deadly. Every weapon fired, every step taken was precise and deliberate. They had fought death countless times, and now they would do it again, for the sake of a galaxy that had not understood them until this moment. "Hold the line," Holt said, her voice calm but commanding. "Do not let them through." The humans were surrounded on all sides. Krail swarmed from the east and west, from the sky and the streets below. Yet they did not panic. They did not retreat. Their movements were fluid, almost unnatural, like predators who knew the patterns of death before it came. Explosions shook the city as the first wave hit. Human flamethrowers roared, sending walls of fire into the advancing Krail. Grenades ripped through swarms, tearing the monstrous enemies apart in showers of black blood and chitin. One soldier leapt from a collapsed building, landing among a pack of Krail, and drove a plasma blade straight through their leader. He emerged unharmed, continuing his advance as if he had done nothing extraordinary. Varnan civilians watched from their hiding places, trembling. Mothers clutched children to their chests. Soldiers who had fought for their entire lives whispered prayers to gods they had long forgotten, and all the while the humans pressed forward unwavering. From the command center, General Vera watched in disbelief. "They are unstoppable," she whispered. "They do not fear, they do not tire, they do not retreat. We begged for heroes, and we received monsters. The battle raged for hours. Streets collapsed, fires consumed entire districts, and the sky above was black with the wings of Krail ships. Yet Holt's soldiers continued to push. When their ammunition ran low, they fought hand to hand, knives flashing, blades cutting through armored chitin with terrifying precision. When one of their own fell, another human dragged them to safety, or if it was impossible, completed the fight in their stead. Holt moved from group to group, coordinating attacks, giving orders with calm authority. Her presence alone was enough to inspire the survivors. Where humans went, the Krail feared. Where humans held, the city still stood. At one point, a Krail queen emerged from a hidden spire, enormous and writhing, commanding thousands of soldiers at once. Holt did not hesitate. She called a squad, and they stormed the spire, firing explosives into the structure while one soldier, critically injured, crawled to the base and detonated a charge that collapsed the spire entirely. The queen shrieked, falling into the rubble, and the swarm above hesitated. By nightfall, the humans had created a narrow corridor through the Krail forces, giving the surviving Varnans a chance to escape. Yet the humans did not leave. They stood among the corpses and burning ruins, their weapons still smoking, their bodies battered and bleeding, and yet their eyes burned with relentless fire. A young Varnan child approached Holt, shaking, and asked, Are you the heroes?" Holt knelt, her armor scraping against the rubble. "No," she said softly. "Heroes die too soon. What you see is what we have become to survive. We are monsters, and we fight because we must." The child stared, wide-eyed, trembling between fear and awe. Holt rose slowly, surveying the battlefield. The Krail Queen's forces were shattered, but the war was not over. Still, she allowed herself a single thought, a cold, grim smile beneath her helmet. We survive. That is all that matters. The surviving humans began moving systematically, finishing off remaining Krail soldiers, setting traps to stop any regrouping. Every action was brutal, efficient, and precise. The Varnans began to whisper their names in awe and terror. They had called for heroes, but they now knew. They had received something far stranger, far more terrifying. Monsters. Human monsters. And monsters do not give up. Monsters do not forgive. Monsters fight until the last enemy falls, or until they themselves are nothing but ash. Tonight, humanity had become the savior of a galaxy that had never understood them, and in the burning ruins of the Varnan capital, no one dared to look away. The sun rose slowly over the ruins of the Varnan capital. Smoke still spiraled into the sky, and the ground was black with ash and the bodies of the fallen. Silence settled over the battlefield, a silence so complete it pressed against the ears and heart. The Krail were gone, their fleet shattered, their hive leaders destroyed. The battle had ended, but the cost was immense. On the ground, the survivors moved cautiously. Varnan soldiers, exhausted and trembling, began to search through the rubble for their families, their comrades, their homes. Many found nothing, many wept. And in the midst of the devastation stood the humans of the 13th Legion, fewer than half of what had landed months ago, their armor scorched, their bodies bleeding, their weapons worn and broken,